Hey, it's Meredith with Phonetic Fluency, and in today's video I'm going to teach you how to pronounce all the consonant sounds of American English. In addition to having far more vowel sounds than many other languages, and if you want to learn those, I will link the video below, we also have a large number of different consonant sounds. Depending on what your native language is, there might be a lot of consonant sounds that are new for you. For example, Spanish has about 15 consonant phonemes, while American English has 26. That's 11 brand new sounds that you need to master. Regardless of what your native language is, that's a lot of sounds for you to learn. So don't worry about memorizing and perfecting them over the course of this video. Making permanent changes to your pronunciation requires replacing your current speech habits with new speech habits. And the best way to do this is through repetition practice. When you do repetition practice, you repeat the new sounds over and over, kind of training the muscles in your mouth to get used to these sounds to the point where it begins to feel normal and natural and something that you can do without even thinking about it. The only way we can do this is through repetitive training so that you build new muscle memory. In this video, we're going to go through all of the sounds relatively quickly because there are so many of them. But if you want to make this improvement to your pronunciation permanent, download the free Listen and Repeat PDF and audio file, which you can find linked in the description below. So what you should do as I go through each sound is pay careful attention to exactly what I'm doing with my mouth and the sound that you hear, and then just try to imitate it exactly. So try to put your mouth in the same position as mine, and try to make the sound that you make sound like the sound that I made. Once you've downloaded the free PDF practice sheet from the link in the description below, you're ready to get started. Ready? Let's go. This video is divided into categories based on where in the mouth we are making the sounds, that is, place of articulation. Let's start with the bilabial consonants, and as it sounds like bilabial, these are the sounds that I make using my two lips. As we go through these sounds and you're saying them out loud with me, I want you to really pay attention to how you're using your two lips and only your lips to make each of these sounds. Starting with the first sound. M. M. My. Next sound. P. P. Pay. The sound is a little bit more aspirated than in Spanish, so that means that you're going to close your lips tight and have a big puff of air when you release. Pay. Next we have B. B. Buy. Once again, just like the last one, in this sound we're going to press the lips together just a little bit more firmly than you would in Spanish, really blocking the air and then letting it out in a kind of big explosion. B. The difference is that here my voice is on. My voice has to be on to make the right sound. B. W. W. When. I want you to be extra careful with this sound because I hear a lot of native Spanish speakers, when they see the letter W, they tend to pronounce the sound kind of like G, G. And we're going to get to that sound later on. That sound is produced in the back using a totally different part of the mouth. We use the tongue and the velum, like G, G, G. It's happening in the back. And this sound doesn't require that at all. It's in the section bilabial because I'm only using my lips to make the sound. It's only up here in the lips. Your tongue shouldn't be doing anything at all. So no G, G, G. It's just W. And that's it for our bilabial sounds. Moving on to the next category, which is labiodental consonants. These next two sounds are going to be labiodental, which means lips and teeth. As you can see in the diagram, in this case we're using the top teeth and the lower lip, so pay careful attention to that as we go through the sounds. The first one is fine. Then we have very. A lot of Spanish speakers struggle with the difference between B and V. Notice, B is bilabial, so we're using our two lips closing and releasing. In this case, it's teeth and lips, so it's a really different production. Very. Moving on to our next category, we have our dental consonants. The dental sounds involve sticking the tongue between the teeth and then the air flows out through the teeth. What you need to watch out for here is making sure that your tongue is sticking out enough during these sounds. With. And now the same thing, but with the voice on, creating vibration. There. Remember, the key is sticking the tongue out enough. Moving on to our alveolar consonants. When I say that these sounds are on the alveolar ridge, that term might sound a little technical, but don't worry, we're going to figure out exactly where that is together. If you take your tongue and start from the teeth and kind of pull your tongue back like this, when your tongue is no longer touching the teeth, but it's touching like this bumpy place before you get to the rest of the palate, that is the alveolar ridge. This is the place in your mouth you touch for sounds like na na na, ra ra in Spanish. So that same place is the alveolar ridge. A lot of the alveolar sounds can be written with the same letter and pronounced very similarly, but just a little bit different between languages, so it's important to really pay attention to the placement here. You have to make sure that your tongue is touching only the alveolar ridge for these sounds, so not the teeth, not even a little bit. If you're a native Spanish speaker, you might be used to kind of touching the teeth a little bit for the sounds the, but in English, that sound is further back inside the teeth. So pay careful attention to the placement for each of these sounds as we go through them. N, n, no, t, two. So in this sound, remember, no teeth at all. It needs to be firmly on the alveolar ridge, and the sound is a little bit tenser with more aspiration than it would be in Spanish. So that means there's like a big puff of air coming out of the mouth when I release the sound. T, t. I like to think of it like a cymbal. You know, you're playing the drums. T, t, t. That's the sound t for two. D, d, dad. Just like we talked about with the T sound, in this sound as well, we also need to make sure the tongue is firmly touching only the alveolar ridge. Da, 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 da. That's our American D sound. And the voice is on, so da, da, da. I'm making a vibration. D, d, dad. Ada, ada. Butter. With the sound, you might notice I added a little vowel sound before it, and that's because it's the same as our D sound, and in fact, most Americans, if you ask them, they would hear it as a D sound, but the difference is, instead of holding the tongue there, d, d, I'm doing one little flap of the tongue and touching the alveolar ridge, ada, 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 which is why I add the vowel sound before, so that I can have a sound going, lift my tongue up, and tap once for the r sound. You might notice that this is the same placement as the Spanish R sencilla, like we have in pero, para. It's the same. The only difference is that in American English, the sound needs to be a little bit more clear, so we can't get kind of soft about it, because I often hear Spanish speakers say like butter, and I don't really hear that clear tap that the tongue makes against the alveolar ridge, so I need to really hear it. Butter, butter. Our next sound is s. So, and then we have z, z, was. The placement for this sound is exactly the same as in the S sound, but now I have the voice turned on, so I'm creating a vibration, like a B. So I'm creating an actual buzzing sound with my mouth in the same mouth position as before. Z. You might have noticed that our example word was is written with an S, but I'm pronouncing that S as z. That's right, the sound z, which we kind of think of as a Z sound, is actually not written with a Z very often. It's written with an S far more frequently. That's why I recommend you do the practice sheet so that you can get used to pronouncing these words in this way, because even words where you have a written S, a lot of the times that S is actually sounding like Z. Our next sound is L, all. In American English, we use what we call the dark L compared with the light L that we would use in Spanish. So notice in Spanish, la la, hola, la la la. When I make the L sound, I'm creating like a lot of space between my tongue and the palate or the roof of my mouth. So only the very tip touches and I have a lot of space. La 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 la. For the dark L or the American English L, we're gonna do the same thing, just the very tip of the tongue is touching the alveolar ridge, but instead of creating all this space, I'm just gonna bring my jaw up and therefore bring the rest of my tongue up, and it's kind of engaged. It's not touching anything, only the tip of the tongue is touching, but it's kind of like creating a more guttural sound just because it's higher up and closer to the palate. So let's look at the difference. La la la. La la la, la 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 la. That's our dark L. That's it for our alveolar sounds. So let's move on now to our postalveolar consonants. So we identified where the alveolar ridge is in our last group of sounds, and so now we're just gonna pull the tongue back just a little bit further to just behind the alveolar ridge, and that's where we're going to produce all of these sounds, just like you see here in the diagram. Starting with our first sound, we have ch, ch, much. Notice that the sound is plosive. That means I'm putting my tongue in this position and then letting the air out. Ch, ch. It explodes out. Next we have j, j, just. So for this sound, it's exactly the same as the last sound, the ch sound, but in this case, we need the voice to be on. So I'm creating a vibration. I put my tongue up, stop the air, let it down, let the air out, but my voice is on the whole time. J, just. Next we have sh, sh, she. So this is another voiceless sound, but in this case it's an extending sound. I can make the sound long, shh, because the air is just constantly flowing out. Shh. Next, zh, zh, vision. Now I'll let you in on a little secret. I don't actually normally teach the sound to my one-on-one coaching students, and that's because it's just not that common. The sound, of course, does exist in a certain limited number of words in English, but they're just not very many words, and most of the time whatever you're saying is probably fine in order to understand what the word is, so it's not really interfering with comprehension. But this video is about going through all of the consonant sounds of American English, so of course we have to look at zh. This sound comes from French, where it is a lot more common, for example, in je m'appelle. But again, we have it in English just in a very few number of words. Our next sound is er. Now before we look at the example word, I want to just talk about only the sound. Try to forget about the letters. You probably already know which letter it is. Just try to put it out of your mind and just think about only the sound. That's the sound we're talking about here. Let's compare it with another sound. R or r, If you're really listening only to the sounds without thinking about letters, those sounds don't really sound the same, do they? In fact, they sound really different. The problem is they share a letter. So if you're a native Spanish speaker or Italian or many other languages, the letter R sounds like R or R. In English, this is not the case. The letter R only sounds like So if you make this mistake and you pronounce words like from or very or right, this is coming from trying to pronounce the letter R as you already know it from your native language. Because in English, it doesn't sound like that. In English, it only sounds like So to master this sound, it is a postalveolar sound, and it's an approximate. So that means my tongue isn't actually touching anything. What I'm actually doing here is I'm kind of pulling my tongue back and bunching it up in the mouth and kind of creating a tension. And that's how I make the sound. So I bunch the tongue back, make tension, and I don't touch anything. That's our R sound. And so now we can look at our example word, right. I know the sound is pretty challenging for non-native speakers, but just give it the best try that you can. Try to imitate the exact sound that you hear me making, and don't forget to download the PDF so that you can do listen and repeating practice and get used to the feeling of making an sound in all of these R words. That's it for our postalveolar sounds, and so now we're moving on to palatal consonants. And in English, we actually only have one palatal consonant. A palatal consonant is where the tongue touches or gets close to the hard palate, so the rest of your palate that we haven't covered so far. The only palatal consonant we have in English is an approximate, meaning that it doesn't actually touch. The tongue doesn't actually touch anything. It's just going to get close to the palate before coming back down. This part is really important. So that sound is y. You. Be very careful that your tongue doesn't accidentally touch or create friction. I hear native Spanish speakers frequently pronounce this ju, instead of you. So my tongue is lifting up, but it's not touching. You. So that's our only palatal consonant. Moving on now to velar consonants. The velar sounds can be a little bit hard to explain because it's in the back of the mouth where the sound is happening, so it's a little hard to see and actually understand what's going on back there, but I'm going to teach you. Let's start by looking at the diagram where you can see where the velum actually is. So for these velar sounds, you'll be using the back of your tongue, and that back of the tongue is going to be lifting up and touching the velum, which is the very end of your palate, back where it starts to get kind of soft. When you practice these sounds, I recommend you try it with a mirror and kind of lean back a little bit so that you can see all the way into the back of your mouth and see what's actually going on back there. This is going to help the mind-visual connection so that you understand what parts of your mouth you're moving and then have a little bit more control over them. So let's get into the velar sounds. The first one is ng. I'm going to try to lean back so that you can see. Not quite. Let me try with a... There we go. Ng. King. Now you might ask yourself, is this not just a n and a g? Kind of, yes. I mean, the resulting sound is the same, we spell it that way, but that in sound, we don't make it in the front like we normally would, na 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 na, and then go to the back for ga 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 ga, but rather we combine them. So we make an n, but with the back. G, ng. That's why this is one sound. Ng, king. Next we have k, k. And let's look with the light. K, can. Our final velar sound is g, 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 go. So this sound is exactly like the K sound that we saw before, but now with the voice on. So we have k, k, k. The tongue is lifting up in the back, touching the velum, but I'm doing it just with air, with no voice. K. And then for this sound, I'm doing the exact same thing. Back of the tongue lifts up, touches the velum, but now my voice is on. I'm creating vibration. G, g, go. That's it for the velar sounds, and so now we're on to our very last category, which are the glottal sounds, which might be actually the hardest to explain because they don't exist in very many languages, definitely not in Spanish, and probably not in very many languages in general, and they happen here in the throat. So there's really no good way for me to show you what's happening in here inside the throat when I make these sounds. So the best thing you can do is imitate and just try your best to make the exact same sound that you hear me make. If the sound that you make sounds the same as the sound that you hear me make, and you kind of felt something happening here in your throat when you did it, you probably got it. So now let's look at our two glottal consonants. The first one is he. So here we have this kind of soft sound, like we're kind of getting the glottis kind of close and creating some kind of a little friction, but with only air. He, how. That's our H sound. Now, if you're a native Spanish speaker, it's not he or how. Softer, softer. He, how. That's our first glottal sound. Now let's look at the next one. Button. Now, it might sound like I'm just choking there, but this is a real sound and it's called the glottal stop. This exists in other Englishes besides just American English, but its usage varies. In American English, we tend to use it to replace the T when the T falls in certain positions, especially one like this where we have a T between two vowels and it ends with an N sound, like but-in, button. The best way to think of the sound is we have a flow of air and then using the throat, we stop it and then let it out again. So we have You can practice this in a word like uh-oh, uh-oh. Notice, I'm not just saying oh, because that would be without a stop in the middle. You hear something there that's stopping it, right? Uh-oh. And you're doing that with the throat, so that's the glottal stop. Uh-oh, button. This is super common in American English, and in the PDF and audio guide, you can find many examples of where and when we use the sound. And that is it for the 26 consonant sounds of American English. If you've made it to the end of the video, take a moment to congratulate yourself because that is no small feat. That is a lot of information to absorb, and you did it! Hopefully this video was informative, enlightening, maybe entertaining, but as I said, don't hold yourself to the standard that you need to memorize or suddenly know all of these sounds perfectly, because it takes time. This video is to help introduce you to all of the consonant sounds we have in American English, but remember, the best way to really internalize these sounds and start using them yourself is through repetition practice, and you can do that for free using my free PDF with audio file guide. I'm going to link that here and in the description of the video, so just go download that and start practicing. And over time, the more that you practice, the more you will start to see actual changes in your speech habits. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.